Mr. Speaker, members, all adjudicators and members of the House. Today we're debating on the motion, this House provides aid conditional to environmental policy. Now we'll first begin by defining the motion. Okay, first, aid is a government-to-governmental money, a government-to-government process of giving money. By environmental policy, we mean implementing cleaner development process, and we'll give example of this. For example, when you build a new factory or a new dam, you need to take environmental consequences to consequences. If you're building a factory, you need to put sulfur and these harmful filters to filter out these sulfurs or these other harmful toxic material. If you're building a sewage system, you also need to make these filters for it. These are what we call cleaner development process. You will be able to build more factories and sewage system and all things to develop your country, but with all these development projects you do, you will need to implement certain measures so that it becomes a cleaner development process. Our model of how to make this conditional is that the donor states are going to have an agency who will look over this aid-giving process. They will check if the donor states are following the conditions given to them, and by checking, we mean they'll check if the receiving state has proper regulations to it, and also if they are implementing these regulations properly. Because a lot of time in these developing nations, the government has regulations but does not properly implement it due to various bureaucratic or corruption problems. So we'll also be checking if this implementation of this regulation is going on, and if we see that there's a violation of the conditions that we've been giving to these countries, we will be cutting off the aid. This is what we mean by conditional. So now that we have defined our motion, we'll go into our stance. Our stance is that today we have a serious environmental problem facing the world, and that cleaner development process, the principle of cleaner development, sustainable development, is not only possible, it is a moral imperative to implement this principle around the world, not just to certain nations that can afford it, but to every nation around the world. This is our basic stance. Our basic stance today is that we want this this principle of cleaner and sustainable development to be implemented all around the world. So we have three arguments today. The first two will be dealt by me, and they deal mainly with the donor country's side, and which is, first of all, that there's a moral imperative on the donor country to implement this policy. The second argument we'll be giving is that there are benefits on the international level because of the message that this policy will be sending. Our third argument, which will be dealt by the second speaker, will mainly deal with the benefits by the recipient country, which is mainly the transfer of knowledge. So our first argument, moral imperative. Now we have. Yes, sir.
So who will the donors be? Is it a certain country or a group of countries? What kind of country are you specifically talking about?
In the status quo, the developed nations do give huge amounts of developmental aid to developing countries. So these are the donor countries we're talking about. And I'll be shortly saying that when a country gives an aid to another country for the purpose of development process, we are saying that they have a moral imperative to make sure that there is also an environmental side going on. And that will be the argument that I'll be shortly giving you. So first argument, there's a moral imperative, and by this we have 3 points we're trying to say. First is that this is the duty of the donor country to do this. Okay, why is this? Because because it is a very well-known fact now, because of all these scientific research, we know for a well-known fact that when you do a development process, then there are certain environmental consequences to it. So when a country gives to another country and tells you, use this money to develop your country, the donor country knows that there are going to be environmental consequences of this giving aid to that country. And so we're saying that it is very irresponsible, not against their moral duty, for the donor country to give this aid, but at the same time ignore the fact that giving aid to them does harm to the environment of that receiving country. No. And we are saying that this is the duty that they have. And there are two specific reasons why this duty exists. First is that environmental damage is irreparable, and if it is possible of repairing it, it is going to be at a very, very great cost. So if we just simply give money to the receiving country and say, you may develop it, and later maybe you can care about the environment later. No, we're saying that once damage is done, it's almost irreparable and if possible very costly. So what the morally good donor country should do is say that, yes, we'll give you this this aid to develop your country, but you should do it in a way that is sustainable, so that you won't have to meet this huge environmental cost later in the stages of your development and later. So that is what a very good moral giving country should do. So this is a very moral thing. And our second sub point to the moral imperative argument is that environment is now a global issue. So again, it's a very global issue. It's not just the issue of one country. So again, as a donor country, as a developed country, as a leading country of the world, when they give aid, they need to care about this consequences of their giving aid to a developing country, which is more environmental damage in those developing countries. And we believe that it is the duty of the developed countries to take care of it. Our second argument is that there are benefits on the international level. First of all, the donor state has a better image, because will receive better image, because what this policy is doing is that it is sending a message that it's not just the donor countries the developed countries are not just going to be saying, yeah, you guys are bad because you're having a bad environment. What we're saying is that the donor country is taking responsibility of both the development process and the environmentally protection process, where the donor country is taking responsibility. It's not just words about let's solve the environment in the global way. And by this action of showing that they are going to take responsibility of both process, we believe that it's going to reduce tension between these two worlds. Currently, there's huge tension between the developing world and the developing. Whenever we have environmental conference, there's huge tension between these two groups, because the developing countries are very suspicious of what the developed countries are trying to do to them. But we are saying that by this policy, we're sending a message that we're going to take responsibility for both processes of development and environment. And for this reason, we are very proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 24 seconds.
Okay, I thank the Prime Minister. You are now invited to hear about the
Mr. Speaker, I'm very saddened by the fact that the government has no idea whatsoever about the status quo and what we're supposed to do about the problem that exists. Now, they haven't really given us a very clear definition, but basically their definition is just saying that aid, any aid, so we're assuming that this aid refers to humanitarian aid as well. So now, if it's humanitarian aid, now, is it really moral to put all these conditions onto it when people are suffering right now, when we need aid right now in that? So now, also moving on to this environmental policies, they just defined it as cleaner development policies. Now, then assume, because there weren't any other definitions about it, we're assuming that these are cleaner development policies developed here in the 21st century. But ladies and gentlemen, most of the developing countries are still pretty far back away. And if we try to implement this state-of-the-art policy and state-of-the-art regulation rigorously into these developing countries, it's not going to really work. So, because it's going to put too much pressure on it, and which I will discuss further on in my substantive points. And also, basically, they're talking about all this moral imperative and a message that they're trying to send. But because they also define donors as simply developed countries, we're assuming that includes the United States as well. And the United States is completely ignoring the Kyoto Protocol. It's not in the Kyoto Protocol. In the Stockholm Conference, Obama came to it, but nothing came out of the conference. So the US is doing nothing for saving the environment. And the US is a very large contributor to the world pollution problem we have then. So, okay, so US is not going to solve its own problem, and it's just going to tell these other countries with this bait of money to solve your problem? No, I don't think so. No, thank you. So, now, with the rebuttals being said, let me get on to my constructive case. Now, the opposition today believes that the status quo, in the status quo, there is a problem of environmental solution. But developing countries don't have the technology, nor the infrastructure, nor the manpower, but they do have the will. And so, our stance today, ladies and gentlemen, is that we should use the carrots, not the sticks. So, our policy model is to offer technological transfer to developing countries, and also offer them these political statements that the environment is indeed an important thing. Now, in the status quo, basically, these developing countries don't have anything. They don't have money. They don't have the technology, so they can't solve the problem. And are you trying to penalize them for not being able to do this? This is just like punishing somebody for being stupid. Now that's completely and your point is?
That is the reason why we're giving aid, and we're saying that with this aid, you can do the development process in a cleaner way.
Yes, but why are you making a condition on aid, on all forms of aid, including humanitarian aid? That's completely ridiculous. So now, the opposition, have 4 points today to support our view. Now, the first point is that this policy would prevent the economic development of third world countries. The second point is that the human rights conditions will worsen in these countries. The third argument is that it sends a wrong message. And the fourth is that environmental protection should come on a regional level. I will discuss the first 2 points. And the Deputy Leader of Opposition, no thank you, the Deputy Leader of Opposition will discuss the other 2 points. So now, moving on to my substantive points. No thank you. Point number 1. It prevents the economic development of third world countries. Now, basically, what the government is trying to do is kicking away the ladder. So, economic development has to happen first on a first-tier industry, which is farming, fisheries, etc., and then on a second-tier industry. Now, they're saying that somehow, if we offer them this aid and with all these conditions, on the second-tier industry, that it's going to be completely eco-friendly. It solves all our economic problems. No, that's not the case. And also, in the theory of economics, for example, now, if we have an industry, these companies will have to compete with already existing countries in developed nations. And so, now, implementing these eco-friendly technology simply increases the cost too much. But whereas the cost is too high for these developing countries, they have a very high cost to face. Their products don't have the same brand power, they don't have the same market share, and they don't have the same prestige that other brands already have established in the market. So how is it going to compete in the market? And what do you have to say?
Your alternative is saying that you're going to transfer technology, yet not giving the money to sustain the technology that you have.
No, that is not the opposition's case at all. We are still going to offer aid unconditionally. Aid should not be conditioned. There should be no conditions on aid, especially humanitarian aid. And what we should be doing in order to tackle the environmental problem is to offer technological transfers and also political statements. So on the first point again, Western countries have also done this in the past. Western countries have finished their development while polluting the world. So the blame should rest on the Western countries, on developed countries. And is it really morally justifiable for these Western countries to say, oh, that was a thing of the past, so we can't do anything about it, but you shouldn't be doing it, so just forget about economic development? No, thank you. So, now, with that being said, they're just basically coming up with all these outrageously high standards of the 21st century. Now, moving on to my second point. The human rights condition will worsen in all these third world countries because Now, the government is not going to offer any aid if they don't accept the conditions. And for many countries, this is impossible to accept the conditions because I have mentioned to you before that it's not economically feasible. It is a bad economic choice. So they will not accept the aid, and without aid, they are also doomed because on their own, they cannot develop their industry. So they're doomed this way, they're doomed the other way, so they're doomed anyway. So now they don't have any money whatsoever. And in this third world country, these third world countries will lie in shambles and poverty will reap upon the earth. So, now, it hurts the human rights of those living inside the third world. Now, we need basic sustenance for these people. We need bread, we need water, we need food on the table right now. We need a house for them to live in, and they don't have anything of this, but the government is not going to offer any of this in the form of aid or whatsoever because of these highly outrageous conditions. So, now the question we have to ask is, children are dying out there, and the government is going to just stand idly by with their hands in their pockets while people are dying? Is this a policy we need to follow? That is the question you ask yourselves. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 24 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Now I call Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on what side of the government is trying to propose to you today is the simple message that environmental problems are not designated to certain countries, which is the status quo. Responsibilities are divided to certain countries that are only willing to participate, and we think this is an extreme problem. We think it's a humanitarian crisis that all nations have to have responsibility, and if no one's willing to take the responsibility, then countries like America, the most developed countries, should have the moral initiative to push developing countries to take responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. Now, we like to clarify the definition that they have trouble understanding, because in aid, we mean aid using industrial processes, and we have development. So they have cleaner procedures of their industrial growth, Mr. Speaker. What we're also talking about is the developed countries and developing countries. If you look at the nature of these developed countries, Mr. Speaker, they do have a very strong incentive indeed to transfer technology to these countries. We see this in cases of America transferring wind technology and solar technology to India. We also see Poland transferring wind technology to countries like Thailand. In these cases, we believe that these countries are willing to give moral initiatives to tell them, you have to take responsibility too, by giving conditions. And we think these very conditions, these environmental conditions, are the very policies that make them listen. Because if we only give money, as the opposition is mentioning today, then they'll be using that to develop their economies without the consequences of their development with the industrial process, Mr. Speaker. Our policy with conditions is telling you that they have environmental consequences, that you have to abide by certain procedures if you want to develop cleanly. And this is the difference between side government and opposition. We believe that, first of all, the nature of developing countries also is one that is in a global crisis in the status quo. We see that they are very vulnerable in nature to the environmental crisis that is going on. We see sea levels rising in Bangladesh. We also see crop failures and starvations in developing countries. And we also see lack of prevention mechanisms in these countries. That is why we need to tell them, by giving conditions, that these are the procedures, the prevention mechanisms that you need to follow. If you don't do that, we're not going to give you aid. You're not going to be able to use our aid, because these are the very steps that you have to follow in terms of developing a very clean technology, Mr. Speaker. That's our basic line. Before I go into my case and telling you about the benefits of the recipients, we'd like to further go on to some points raised by the opposition. We think that, first of all, when they said that why would donor countries why would donor countries make conditions? Well, we think that because it is very contradictory that if we give aid without any conditions at all, it means you can use the money to do whatever you want. In case of development growth, unhealthy, uncleanly, we don't care. This is a very contradictory notion that the donor country is sending, because we don't not care. We should pose responsibilities these developing countries, Mr. Speaker, and not to destroy the environments by the developmental consequences. Mr. Speaker, we also believe, in terms of the costly wise, we don't understand why cost is such a problem, because we think that starvation and those kind of things going on is further better in our case, because we give aid in the first place. We give aid by saying, if you listen to this, because this is more important. I've told you, in Bangladesh and in developing countries, and where these countries don't have the preventive mechanism, right now they're starving already. They're doing that because of when we follow these economic consequences and you have preventive measures, and only when you have these pulse aid conditions, preventive measures that we are imposing and they're not, is the way you can further on in the long term have a better economic consequence and not starve your people due to the vulnerable nature of the developing country, Mr. Speaker. We also see that in these, what they said is that in the status quo, very contradictory, because the first speaker came up and first said that developed countries don't have the incentive to do this in the first place. And then he contradicted himself by saying, no, but in the status quo, they're much more willing to do this. We don't understand what kind of message, I'll take you in a moment, what kind of message they think developed countries do have. Yes, sir.
Our stance was that they do have the will, but they don't have the infrastructure or the technology or the know-how. So what have you been listening to?
So that's why I said countries like American developing European countries like Poland are still doing that because they do have the infrastructure, because they do have the technology to transfer. But they're doing it in a condition where they follow the environmental conditions, because if they don't, then in the long term, starvation, cost-wise, it would take more, Mr. Speaker, on terms of burdens of developing countries. Mr. Speaker, our point is this, that the recipient countries are going to have benefits in various stages of analysis. First of all, they aren't willing to change if we don't put any conditions such as these. Because in the status quo, we see they're very unlikely to take any environmental measures. We see that extreme measures, such as the cap and trade, and international criticism based on nothing to the developing countries are only hurting them and not making them move or budget in terms of environmental needs or responsibility. We think this is a problem. We think the willingness is given by aids. Yes, we think the carrot itself is aids. We think that if we give the carrots like America and Poland has done to these developing countries, then they'll be much more willing to change environmentally, Mr. Speaker. In the long term, this will be less costly. We also think that in terms of this, when you set conditions in terms of our regulation, the regulation agency, the conditions they set are also the ones like how to build dams effectively and how to have better wind solar powers in your countries. We think that these are sorts of transferring technologies, Mr. Speaker. And these conditions that we give environmentally are the very steps that tell them that we are giving you this kind of knowledge to build fundamental, better environmental safety technologies, Mr. Speaker. So on side of government, what we wanted to say to you today is this, is we fundamentally think that environment is a humanitarian crisis. We think that the initiative is on the developed countries. And if we just give money, like the opposition wants to do, it will never solve the problem, because these developing countries have no initiative to do so in the first place. They have been internationally criticized and they're not going to move environmentally. They don't have an initiative to change, Mr. Speaker. But if we give regulation agencies there and check the procedures, we think that this is a long-term preventive measure for them to take. Less starvation in their countries, less sea levels rising, less people wandering around because they don't have houses to go, Mr. Speaker. We think that environments are better in prevention rather than trying to clear it up, because it's irreversible, Mr. Speaker. We think that if the developed countries don't take this initiative and put in conditions and just pour money to these developing countries, this is what's sending a message that you can destroy the environment as much as you want. And we don't want to send that message, Mr. Speaker. We want some regulations by these donor countries, and we want to say that environmental responsibility is also on you. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 13 seconds.
Okay, thank you. The House recognizes the theory of opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speakers. Now, today, without further ado delay, I'd like to move on to the rebuttals that I prepared for the government side, and then move on to the constructive case from the opposition. Today, I've categorized my rebuttals into three categories. First, about the contradictions the side government has made, about the no-response problem that the government did not attack certain arguments that we have raised, and third, about the logical fallacies that the government side has made. So, number one, let's start off with the contradictions. Well, they've contradicted themselves that the countries have the capability but not the will, and that they will have to force them to have the will. Mr. Speaker, the government side conceded that there are people who are starving to death. Basically, that the social infrastructure and the economy is practically inexistent in these third world countries. So how can you say that they have the technology or the infrastructure to implement the 21st century technology? It's basically putting a 21st century engine on a, 1960 car and hoping that the car will run fine. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't work like that. You have to have a car that can match the engine. No, thank you, ma'am. Also, another contradiction. Well, they talked about the moral initiative, the United States saying to the world that you need a cleaner world. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's contradictory because the United States itself is quite reluctant to send this message based on the inside policies. It's practically saying that United States, well, you can do whatever you want, but to the outside world, you have to cry out that we have to protect the country. We have no responsibility, but you do. Why? Because we're paying you to do so. Mr. Speaker, that is totally contradictory, and it is also immoral at the same time. Another contradiction. Well, they said that under our model, or not under if we go against their model, we're practically saying that we're giving out money for free. But Mr. Speaker, listen to their definition, the definition that the Deputy Prime Minister was so proud of clearing. Well, she said that the aid was for what? Development, for a certain purpose, to create infrastructure. Then how can we dare say that under their definition, the money would be used for any purpose when they specifically designated the purpose of the aid they will provide? No, thank you, ma'am. They won't be able to create villas or buy champagne or whatever with the money. They will have to create facilities or build factories, create an economic infrastructure. Why? Because that's the reason why they give it to them, not just for Carbia or whatever. Now, the no response problem. Well, Mr. Speaker, we have talked about the living conditions of the citizens that will go down. At the end of the day, if you set these criteria or certain conditions, the fact is that aid given to these countries will decrease. Why? Because it's harder to get it. Quite normal. So at the end of the day, some countries will have less money, or all countries will have less money, and with less money, the economic situation in these countries will get worse. So what are you going to do with the people who will not be able to receive the money? Because the people who really have to think about is not the government officials that already have the villa and the status quo. It is the citizens that live with less than $1 a day, less than 50 cents a day. These are the people who will directly benefit from the aid we are providing, because creating factories or creating economic infrastructure is basically for the many citizens, not for the president or the government official that decides whether you've received the aid or not. This will be further elaborated in my arguments. Now, moving on to the logical fallacies. Well, Mr. Speaker, well, they said that developing countries are under crisis. Now, isn't that quite evident that if your country is in an environmental crisis, that you won't have someone to dictate to protect it. You would protect it on your own. Why? Because you recognize the fact that you have a problem. No, thank you, ma'am. If sea levels are rising and your country is practically disappearing, would you make much of an effort to make sure that your country disappears quicker? No, thank you. So, moving on to the constructive case of the opposition. Now, I would like to once again state our stance, which is that we should use the carrot instead of the stick. Argument number 3 is that environmental protection should be based on a regional basis. Well, I have two levels within this argument. The first is that every country has different standards. Now, this different standard can be developed in two levels. Well, first is the standard that the United States or the so-called developed countries use. So under their model, they're not really confident or sure which condition they would use, so I have to develop in two levels. Well, number 1 is if they use the same levels that the United States or the country that are providing the aid use. Well, as the Prime Minister said, it's 21st century conditions imposed on a 1960 country. It is morally, logically, feasibility impossible. So we're number 2. Well, what if they set a unilateral standard? Because if you differentiate the standard too much, well, it would seem that they would give the message that they're being unfair to certain regions. Well, what will happen then? Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know that environmental protection is different based on an economic standard and regional basis. You cannot impose the same environmental conditions to Korea, to China, and to the United States. That's why every country has their own set of environmental standards. No, thank you, ma'am. Well, Mr. Speaker, we cannot dictate a certain country to have certain kind of environmental levels. It has to vary based on their economic and regional level, and we say it is impossible to do that under their model. Now, number 2 level of this analysis. Well, such requests, we say that the request for environmental protection should not only come from the outside, but also from the inside. And so how can we make the people inside the country want environmental protection? Let's take a look at history, since we all know that history repeats itself. Well, in the Industrial Revolution, what happened? People were so eager to develop. They created factories. Smog was in England, when for a fact, they said environment was irreversible, but luckily it is. England isn't as bad during the Industrial Revolution. Well, anyways, during the Industrial Revolution, everyone was willing for development. Now let's take a look at England. Do you really think that the people want that much development? No. Why? Because there are higher living conditions. People want more than money. What do they want? A better living condition, cleaner environment, cleaner water, and cleaner everything. Let's take also a look at Korea. In the 1960s, Korea was not that interested in environmental protection. Just a second, I'm going to talk about Korea, and I'll take you. Well, 1960s, Korea wasn't that interested in environment. Nowadays, what do you see? We see cleaner environment. Everyone is going towards green and practically saying that green is green and green is money and everything like that. So, Mr. Speaker, let the countries develop. If they develop, the people on the inside will want those improved conditions. And yes, sir.
Precisely, that development, these developing countries do not have those environmental will right now, so we're giving them incentive to have these environmental regulations.
Thank you, sir. We already told you continuously that conditions on aid will decrease the amount of aid. That is something that they also conceded, because if you have conditions but the amount doesn't decrease at the end, well, what's the purpose of the condition? Well, Mr. Speaker, basically, what they're saying is that the countries that have the will now have less money, and that with less money, we hope you have better environmental conditions. It is practically illogical. So, Mr. Speaker, provide the aid, help them grow, and they will set their own standards. Now, moving on to the wrong social message this will send to the international community. Mr. Speaker, what is aid? Aid is something that is benevolent. Aid is something that for humanitarian reasons. You want to help them not because they're you want to impose something. It's because they're same humans, and we say you also have the right to development or a better life than what you have. It's basically based on the principle nobis oblige, and that's why we say that we should implement and we should provide aid. Now, Mr. Speaker, what happens if we put conditions on this so-called benevolent aid? It suddenly becomes a political tool for the developed countries to tell or dictate to the developing countries, do this, do that, or we won't pay you. And at the end of the day, what will happen? Well, number one, countries will think that strings are attached to aid. They will be reluctant to receive the aid because the government officials, the president or the leader of the company will want control over their country. Number two, if they cannot fulfill these requests, they will not even have the chance to receive the money that can be the potential growth, the potential source of growth within their country. And number three, there is no benefit in implementing such rules because the income granted from aid will be greater than the money that is provided, and that is why we're proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 37 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Now let's invite the government whip.
Mr. Speaker, when we came up and first defined this motion, we gave you very clear two principles: sustainable development. I think it was pretty clear the context that we desire to put this debate under and what the fundamental issue at stake is. The fundamental issue is whether you should give aid that is tied to environmental policy, or you just give aid so that government can use it freely. And that is a fundamental issue. But they came up here and tried to really twist their words so that they bring up multiple issues. The stance they took at the end of the day is essentially the same thing as ours. Their problem, I'll prove to you later how it is exactly the same, and how under their model it doesn't even solve anything, but not only that, they're really unrealistic. Okay, let's go on to how their solution is really much similar as ours. They came up here and said that the reason why, we are giving money to the government to impose, so that they can create laws that regulate the environment. The Prime Minister mentioned this, and as well impose regulations in the end, making the firms buy the technology, buy the filter systems and such that fulfills these regulations so that they can get subsidies. So in the end, we're incentivizing them to buy these environmentally regulated products to install on their industries, stuff like that. What they're saying is that they're going to instead of money, they're going to use the money within the country to buy the technology for environmental purposes. So in the end, Mr. Speaker, the thing is, this technology is environmental. The end product, the really important thing is, this team is saying we give technology for environmental purposes. This team is saying it's for environmental purposes as well. The issue here is that we're trying to pass this motion so that aid is conditional to environmental policy. They came up here and talked about the same thing, where aid is also conditional to environmental policy, except the form is just different. The only problem, the only shift they came up with, the little twist they came up with, was that technology will be easier to implement in these countries because these countries don't have a basic layout of the technologies, so that you have to go in and do everything for them. But if you give money, then what you're doing is you're just telling them to use the money with your wise knowledges and like do what's best for themselves. But we said when we go into those countries, there are regulations and guidelines. These translate as knowledges as to what specific things you need to do to protect the environment while you develop. So we believe that this is also it's a spillover technological knowledge transfer. It's practically the same thing, Mr. Speaker. When they came up with their model, it was really unrealistic. They defined technology transfer as indefinite. Like it's going to because our regulations is going to be state of art, but their technology is going to be infinitely provided. First of all, you can't do that under Title 8. In which country would you see an infinite provision of aid? Anything, even if it's transferred technology. Technology costs money, sweetheart. It also has its own machinery, it has knowledges. So you're not even considering that. I don't understand how you can come up with that kind of thing. So you can imagine a scenario in which there are factories you need to build in underdeveloped countries. They don't know how to build their factories safely and cleanly. So you're going to go in and build their factories, build their clean system, build their sewage, build their filtering system, and how are you going to do that with where you get the resources in the first place? Unrealistic, Mr. Speaker. But in the end, they're doing the same thing, except in just a different form. And they say it's a different policy. You're making it tied. They say it's like wrong to have it tied because you're like taking the money to use it on environmental issues when people are like starving in these countries. But I don't see how their motion does anything for the starving people. If you really wanted to save starving people, go to humanitarian aid, which we don't believe is mutually exclusive in this situation. Why are we talking about humanitarian aid in this situation when we set the debate in the context of two principles, sustainable development? See, humanitarian aid, we believe, is not mutually exclusive. And even under their model of giving technological transfer, I don't see how they're going to improve the human condition and the welfare in those countries. Yes.
We're practically all similar except one thing. You have conditions on aid, we don't. If the end is the same, why impose conditions?
Sit down. Okay, I want to ask you, what is your condition? Okay, let me ask you. What is your technology transfer for? That's a purpose. What is it for? It's for environmental reasons. Now, that reason is the condition. That reason is the condition. You're not solving the hunger problem. You're not solving the economic development problem. You're trying to solve the environmental problem, and that's your condition. For our condition, it's also environmental. So, I don't understand how they can pursue a soft side policy in which they're trying to say that environmental policy is a condition that exists for them, but I don't know what they're trying to say. Okay, going back to what I was talking about, Mr. Speaker, under their model, the problems they came up with for us, accusations that we're going to be immoral and abuse as poor people, doesn't even stand for their case. They can't bring it up because they're practically going on the same model. The only difference, as I said, was the fact that they're going to go in and provide infinite amounts of technology for the countries just because they can't install it themselves. Mr. Speaker, we believe when you provide regulations and we set up agency to oversee these regulations, it is better because not only is it cost effective, because you can afford these changes, but we came up here and gave you examples, specific examples where small regulations can make a huge difference. These Western countries have had much research on these environmental issues and extensive experience of environmental contamination. So when they know that when you create a dam for development, you need to weed out the plant so that mercury doesn't bioaccumulate in the system. That's one thing. That's so easy. You weed it out. That's like one regulation that you can put on so that these countries know when you create dams for development, you can pursue it at the minimal cost. And these countries, the donor countries, have an incentive to pursue a very minimal cost-effective regulation because, as we said, the goal is to provide development at the same time environmental sustainability. So it's in the best interest of the donors to see money not wasted on just state-of-the-art technology from nowhere, but we see development and sustainability of environment. That's in the best interest that we see. And that's the goal, that's the spirit of the aid that we're giving this to. So when they came up here, they didn't recognize why we're giving this aid in the first place. We're not trying to impose a state-of-the-art system just for our donor interest. We have a greater international interest in that. There's a recent trend, Mr. Speaker, Scandinavian countries grant and give aid a lot for an international good. We believe this is possible and we're proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 33 seconds.
Okay, now I call opposition witness.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I move on to anything else, one small thing about the definition. We didn't really tackle the definition or posed a serious threat to the definition, but the difference between economic aid and humanitarian aid was unspecified in the Prime Minister's speech. And they have only clarified the definition of the environmental policies, but not aid from the beginning. So we saw a case stripped from the government side. Let me move on to the burden of proof that the both sides had in this debate to link back to the motion and recap the fundamental reason why we are doing this debate in the first place. Now let's look at the burden of the government side. They have to prove that once we make aids conditional, that they have to prove that it will facilitate their willingness even more. But we believe that because of the harsh standards, the countries will end up giving up receiving aid. And also they have to prove that they will be capable. But we believe that the fundamental premise is wrong here. It's not like they want to pollute the environment. Rather, they don't have the very basic infrastructure, and pillars are non-existent in these countries. So development and environmental policies are sometimes mutually exclusive in these countries. Also, they have to prove the benefit of passing their policy, but actually this will only worsen the life standards and further hinder the development of the developing countries. So we believe that this policy is not going to work. The opposition side, we have proven to you, Mr. Speaker, that it will only be kicking the ladder, so it will be unjustified and unable from the first place. And if the two models that we have in this debate were not much different as the government side is proposing, and why not stick with the status quo without the strings attached? No, thank you. Let me move on to the clashes in this debate, which were two. First of all, do we have enough justification to pass this policy? Second of all, is this policy actually going to work? The issue of effectiveness. On the first issue, justification, that they say that donor countries have the moral duty to protect the environment. But we say that they have unrighteous motives to interrupt or control the development of the aid recipients. This will be repeating the mistakes and historical injustice that was done in third world countries during the imperialistic era. The fundamental reason why third world countries, especially African countries and the East Asian ones, remain in a lesser developed state than the first world countries is because they were exploited of their resources and was not left in a situation where they can pursue inherent development. So if we pass this policy today, opposition believe that they will get to be double punished, losing their chance to develop with economic aids they are in need. We believe that once the first world countries have conceded to transferring aid money, they have to keep their promises without such unjustifiable strings attached. And also, sometimes with environmental policies, there are situations where no development whatsoever is possible. For example, let's say there's a country within which forests take 70% of undeveloped area. They won't be able to achieve the developmental level as desired if we concede to the environmental strings that the government is trying to pose on these countries. Also, we'd like to talk about the moral duty of donor countries as well. As we see in the status quo today, U.S., which is the most representative country which is giving out aid to the third world countries, is not keeping its own promises. If they do have a moral duty, why not carry out international regulations themselves? They say that such policy is going to enhance the images of the donor countries, but why not first take the responsibilities that is already imposed on them by the international community to enhance their images furthermore? Yes?
Just because America did not agree to Kyoto Protocol doesn't mean that they don't have an environmental cause.
We're saying that if you want to force others to comply to a certain moral standard, you need to be moral from the beginning. Look at what so-called G2 countries, US and China, which give out huge portions of aid, has totally abandoned its duties in the Copenhagen Summit. And that these countries, and the government side today, they are saying that these countries have a right to have a say in the developing countries, and we believe that this does not really stand. Moving on to the second clash, which is effectiveness, if this policy is going to work. We believe that this policy is not going to work because it was vague from the beginning. Are they going to first impose policies, then give out aid? If we do this, we won't be able to do this from the first place, because we believe that even with these conditions, developing countries will be unable to carry out environmental policies, exactly because they are underdeveloped and lack the public notion and understandings why environment should come before development. Exactly because they are underdeveloped. They say that their policy is simply sending a message that it is desirable to care about the environment, but rather we believe that it is going to hinder further development altogether. It's not like these countries can start off from the 21st century level industry. They need to have fundamental infrastructure, and these fundamental infrastructure is not existent in the status quo. And if, there's another option. If they give the money first and then withdraw the money if the regulations are not kept, for a while, the recipient country will be able to use money without necessarily abiding by the rules that the government party is trying to impose on these countries. So the strings that the government side has attached will not really be likely to work. And to briefly tackle about the technology issue, in the status quo, as the leader of opposition has mentioned, in UNFCCC, Annex 1 countries are transferring environmentally friendly technology, and the developing world has willingness to receive this technology. And they say, what's this for if aid money is not received? What's the difference between their policy and our policy? But we say, if we do this without strings, they can use this technology on their choices and on their willingness. And we believe that there is a crucial difference between the stances of two sides today. So at the end of the day, we believe that this will be a method to kick the ladder of the first countries. So we believe that there is not enough justification to pass this motion. And secondly, we believe that it is not going to work because these recipient countries lack the capability. So we are proud to oppose the motion today.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 36 seconds.
Okay, now let's invite the last speaker from opposition.
Mr. Speaker, during this debate, especially during the last speech of the government side, I had to do something that, unfortunately, I do quite often. I had to doubt my intelligence. Now, let's take a look at what I had to do, and then we'll take a very, my analysis, whether you believe it or not, because I really doubted my intelligence. Now, number one, thank God I understood this part. The goal at the end of the day, well, both parties wanted a better world or a cleaner world, right? Now, number two, this is where I kind of got confused. Well, they said they wanted conditions, and I thought we made it clear that we don't want conditions. But the whip speaker continuously asked about my conditions and started calling me sweetheart. And then I really got confused about what conditions we were trying to impose. But I found out, well, it was quite simple at the end. They wanted conditions. We'll say, do this or no aid. And we said, well, actually, we don't have any conditions at all. So, Mr. Speaker, I found that out. Now, let's take a look at the cases that each side kind of brought up. Well, number one, the government said we will provide conditional aid. And they suddenly talked about technological transfer, and then they talked about weeding, and then they suddenly said that we weren't that different from us. From them. Well, I really couldn't follow that logic. Once again, I doubted my intelligence. Now, number two, they said that conditions would not decrease the total amount of aid, that they would still have the amount of aid. Now, once again, I thought it was quite logical. If you put on sanctions or conditions, it will become difficult to get the aid, and if it becomes more difficult to get the aid, less people would get the aid. Is it not that reasonable or not that easy to understand? Once again, doubted my intelligence. Now, third thing, well, their money, it seemed to be abundant. They had a lot of money. We could provide 21st century artist-state technology, whereas on our side, we were so poor that we couldn't even provide them with aid money, and told us that it was too expensive. Well, number one, Mr. Speaker, I thought that technological transfer was practically granted for free. Once again doubted my intelligence. And then additionally to that, I never thought that in a debate, well, the government's government was richer to the opposition's government. Well, I thought we had the same funding. Once again, I doubted my intelligence. Now, that was the difficult part for me. But I still had the easy part, which was the opposition's case. Well, we practically said, easy and simple, no conditions. Well, why? We had 4 clear reasons. Number one, it's because it's kicking away the ladder. It's unfair for the developing countries. Number 2, people will suffer. Why? Well, let's start off with conditions. Conditions means that it's difficult to get the aid. If it's difficult to get the aid, less aid will be granted, or less aid will inflow to those countries. Now, less aid inflow to the country would mean that there would be less development, because these days development highly depends on money. So less development means that, well, the word less in English means that there's a decrease, or well, this much compared to this much, and this is less, right? So that is the reason why we say people will suffer. Now, number 3. Now, we talked about the environmental conditions and why people want to have a cleaner world. I thought it was quite simple. Richer people want a better quality of life. So the more richer you get, the cleaner environment you will want. Because I thought it was given the fact that people want a clear environment. So, Mr. Speaker, that is why we told you that if you make the country richer, allow the country to economically develop, well, at the end of the day, people would want stronger or better environment. Now, and we also talked about the wrong social message it would send. We thought that aid was benevolent. Maybe we were naive. Maybe I really have to doubt my intelligence on that. But, Mr. Speaker, we thought it was benevolent. That was something they never pointed out. And they're practically saying that we will use aid as weapons. Aid to enforce other countries, to dictate them to do this or to do that. Basically using aid as a tool to infringe sovereignty. Well, I thought it was international law 101, sovereignty is something you do not play with. And that is why I still had to doubt my intelligence, but still thought that we won. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 9 seconds.
Okay, now let's invite the last speaker for this seminar.
We're very glad that the opposition side doubted their intelligence. But we're very not glad that they arrived at the wrong conclusion. Anyways, we'll go on. So what is the purpose of the debate today? And what is the key issue here? The purpose of the debate is who's going to do the better policy for the environment? And they agree, they just agree to it. And the key question here today is, are we going to impose conditions on the A's or not? It's nothing else. There is no other, look at the motion, there is no other question here. The only question we're talking about is condition good or bad? And because the debate, the purpose of the debate, as they agree, is about environment, the question, combine them together, and the question we need to answer is condition good, putting condition good for the environment? Not is it good for the human rights, not is it good for the hunger problem, is it good for the environment? That is the one simple question that they had to answer, that which they did not. So let's analyze. So did they prove that the conditions are bad? No. When we ask them, so what is the problem of putting conditions? They just, what is the problem of putting conditions and what is the problem with the environmental issue? They just keep on evading the environmental issue. Even though they agree that what today's debate should be about environment, they just keep evading and suddenly go towards, but people are dying in Africa. No, we don't care about, yes we do, but this debate, what we are caring about is whether these conditions do good for the environment or not. And they agree, they never objected to that part. And why are they suddenly saying that whenever we raise this question, what is the harm of this condition? Why are they suddenly talking about the dying children in Bangladesh and Africa? No, irrelevance. And then did they bring a better policy, a policy that is better than putting conditions on aid? No, they didn't have a policy actually. They were keep on talking about this policy that was actually better. No, they were not talking about any policy. If they were talking about any policy, it must have been talking about the technological transfer, which we believe is that it's not really, it's the same thing as we're talking. We give aid and then they can buy technology with that aid. It's nothing that negates our policy. It's nothing that's a policy that's different. In fact, we believe that their policy is actually narrower because also the only thing you can do for the environment is just give more technology. You can't do anything. What we were saying was that it's not just about technology, it's also about having proper regulations before you build construction. When you construct things, having proper regulations before doing these constructions and building factories. We were also talking about that. So they were only tackling like a little portion of our case. Our case had putting conditions, and we had various different kind of conditions, not just about transferring technology. And then finally, did they bring up any harm about our policy? No. Again, the only harm that they were talking about is the harm that they are talking about is that the aid is going to decrease. Again, we're talking about the environment here, and we don't see why decreasing aid is going to be harmful to the environment. Maybe it will be harmful because they'll have a slower development. But we believe that even if it's a slower development, if it's environmentally cleaner, we believe that's the better thing for the environment. And again, we're talking about environment. We're not talking about the dying children in Africa. So what have we been talking to you about? We told you that there is a duty, because we're talking about environment here, and when these countries give aid and they know that there's going to be development going on in that country and that development is going to cause environmental damage, we told you that there is a moral duty to prevent this from happening. And did the opposition side tell you anything that negates the problem? We also told you that under the current status quo, there's not on the international level, all that is happening is just these vague talks about, and these vague just tensions between this developing world and the developed world and and all that. And we told you that with this policy, we're going to be saying that developed countries should take responsibility in both matters, especially in the environment. And that is the policy we were talking about. Again, did we hear anything from the opposition from that? No, we did not. And that is why we believe that the government takes debate home today.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds.